Before Jim begins, I want to definitely thank Jim for joining us again. This is Jim's second year with us at our SET seminar. Jim also resides in Houston, where Ashley and I live. So great to be able to bring his work, his insight, his witness into this space. As you all are listening, of course, please feel free to utilize the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat. I'm also going to place in our chat about our SET cohort. So or we call it our social entrepreneurship cohort, which is some of you all may be in this conversation because something is brewing within you. You're actually working on something and you probably could benefit from a intentional 12-month journey in 2022 with other like-minded individuals who are in that process of discernment and development. Our cohort is definitely a place that could be a good fit for you. So I'm going to place that in the chat. That's an application process. We'll be making selections sometime in October. The application ends October the 1st, but definitely want to make sure that whether it's you or someone you know in your local church who may benefit from this type of intentional development process to please apply. So I'll now turn things over to Jim, who will share a bit more about who he is and what he does in the world.
Thanks, Darnell. Really glad to be here today. Would love to be around the table with a cup of coffee, and we only have an hour to cover a course that I teach at Fuller Seminary in a semester. Let's begin just by getting. Would each of you take a minute and introduce yourself? Y'all apparently know each other, but I don't know you. Tell me, I can see your name on the screen, but where you serve and just a little bit about yourself. Ken, you're in the top left-hand corner of my screen. Would you go first?
Sure. My name's Ken Gregson. I'm the senior pastor at Central Christian Church in Bradenton, Florida, which is on the west coast, Gulf of Mexico side, just south of Tampa. And I'm also the president of Central Christian Community Services, which is a social enterprise, separate nonprofit from the church, whose purpose is to provide childcare when school is not in session for children with developmental and intellectual challenges that are on the more moderate to severe side with behavior challenges.
Cool. Thanks, Ken. Let's see, on my screen, Amanda, I'm just going to follow my screen. Would you go next?
Yeah, sure. Hello. I'm Amanda Groves, and I'm coming to you from Kentucky, Western Kentucky. Ken and I know each other because we went to school together, so there's the connection there. And I'm very glad to be here. I'm not with a church right now. I'm kind of in transition. Pray for me. I had an interview last night and gonna go do the audition sermon this weekend, so we'll see. So but I'm intrigued and very interested, and I think it's important, how can we use these big beautiful buildings for more than just Sunday morning? They're beautiful, and I hate to see them go away. So how can we utilize them for the community and
Great.
And do it without, going broke, and I think that can absolutely be done. And I'm also the president of the Kentucky Council of Churches. I'm president of the board for the Kentucky Council of Churches. So I'm kind of listening for them as well.
Great. Welcome, Sydney. We're each taking about a minute to just introduce ourselves so that maybe y'all all know each other, but I don't know you. And so would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Reverend Sydney Avant. I am currently living in Northern Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. I just relocated here a few months ago. And so I am not affiliated with the church yet. I moved here from New York City, and I was a member of Park Avenue Christian Church, and I was bivocational. I am now a retired corporate lawyer, but then I was still practicing law. I was called into ministry, so I was ordained at Park Avenue and was pastor for social justice and in a volunteer capacity while I was there.
Cool. Welcome. Glad to have you
Thank
here. Barbara, we're all taking about a minute to introduce ourselves. Could you take a turn?
Absolutely. I am Barbara Vega. I just began working with National Benevolent Association with April Luton. I'm the Associate Vice President of Development. And I have a background in faith-based nonprofit organizations and over 16 years experience in fundraising. And I'm really excited about what I do because I want to help change the world. And so it's my pleasure to be here among like-minded people. And a lot of good things going on through Disciples of Christ Church. So
Cool.
I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks, Barbara. Richard, would you take a turn?
Certainly, Jim. Good afternoon to you all. I am Reverend Richard Williams. I am the senior minister at First Christian Church, Lawrenceville, which is a northeast suburb of Atlanta. I was former regional staff in charge of new church and church development, and we are looking to start a community development corporation in early 2022 and take advantage of some of the grants and some of the workings that are going on in our county and in our state to be able to provide after school projects and mentoring, especially for troubled teens and those who are suffering from the school to prison pipeline. I'll leave it at that.
All right, good.
Thank
you. Yeah, thank you. Welcome. Pedro, how about you?
I'm Pedro Ramos. I am a pastor here, starting I'm going to be redundant, sorry, new initiative called Comunidad Limen Christian Church. It's officially the first Spanish-speaking open and affirming disciples church here in Tucson, but we are, so we actually were trying to stop using the word church and naming ourselves a collective. And so we're trying to figure out ways of being Jesus followers, disciples, and in a new context where, you know, the collective goes beyond the building, time, the place, but it's about the mission and just figuring out all of those pieces together.
I love that. Thanks, Pedro. And Kathy, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Great.
I'm here in Seattle, Washington. I'm a member at All Pilgrims Christian Church, where I lead the outreach and mission team. And I just want to know what the possibilities are.
Okay.
Don't have a particular project in mind, but part of my view from where I'm sitting now is the fact that we may well be replacing our building in the next few years. And to the extent that I can get ideas about how to make what we move into supportive of this kind of work, I want to have that in mind. I'm part of a group that's starting to look at that possibility through a program with the Church Council of Greater Seattle. And so that's why I'm here.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. And Miriam, we're taking about a minute to just introduce ourselves. There you go. Looks like you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Okay, technical difficulties there. So I'm Jim Herrington. I live in Houston. My connection to the Disciples of Christ started when I served for almost 5 years as a consultant at First Christian Church here in Houston with Michael Dunn as the senior pastor. And then I was a member of the Disciples Church plant in the Montrose community where my wife and I lived for 20 years and where I pastored a church that was a network of house churches where we lived in community with people who are in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction. I grew up in Northeast Louisiana, the Southern Baptist tradition, things about that tradition that added value and really did some formational stuff for me. In Northeast Louisiana in 1977, Time magazine listed East Carroll Parish, which is our county, as the poorest county in the country. And I had grown up in a Baptist church where I had never heard anything about the gospel and poverty. And that was the beginning of a long journey where I'm grateful for what they gave me and where I've moved in some different directions. My journey with change happened when I became the executive director of Union Baptist Association. There are 500 Southern Baptist churches in Harris County. In 1989, we realized that they had been in slow decline over a 40-year period of time. Like I think every denomination, churches turned in an annual report. And if you can watch my hands, our churches had been growing like that over 40 years, and the city had been growing like this over 40 years. And so today, everybody knows this is true, but back then, it was the first time that we began to realize that the city we were becoming a smaller and smaller percentage of the whole. And over time began to recognize that wasn't just true for Baptist, it was true for every denominational tradition that was out there. And so I got hired as a change agent, and almost anything I'm going to share with you today comes in part from what I learned about what not to do. I'm an Enneagram 8. They told me they wanted me to lead change, and so I was all over that. I can look back and see that if you wanted to lead change, best friends, and if you didn't want to go where I wanted to go, you were an obstacle to be overcome by any means. I've gone back and apologized to a lot of people for all the things that all the mistakes that I made about leading change. It's an important topic. So I did that. I did that for 10 years. Had led a very successful, where we used to be a top-down, the denomination tells us locally what to do, and then we do it, to a bottom-up. We became a consulting agency for the churches. 500 Southern Baptist churches, half of them the pastors from 72 different countries around the world, but an all-white staff that not only made change interesting from an institutional perspective, but from a personal perspective. I'll never forget Ratliff saying to me one day, Joe's the pastor of a large African-American church here in the city. And he said, you keep talking about diversity, but you don't want diversity. And I said, tell me what that meant. And he said, tell me when the next training for an usher board is taking place. And I said, I've been on the job about 3 months. I said, I don't know what an usher board is. And he said, precisely. He said, in the African-American church, that's like a central organizing entity. He said, what you really mean is that if a Black church wants to come and take advantage of services and resources that are offered to white congregations, then you're glad to share those with us. But you're not really interested in a truly diverse association. It wasn't true. I was interested in that. Joe educated me in some really helpful ways that day. And so at the personal level, I also have some scars in my body. And I just say all that to say, I know a lot about this topic, and I'm a learner like you are. And most of what I've learned through making mistakes. In the amount of time we have, and I want us to be able to have some discussion, some dialogue. And so in the amount of time that we're going to have, I want to talk about leading change, whether it's trying to repurpose your building, or whether it's try to start a ministry that's designed to meet some human need. I want to talk to you about that I want to talk to you about that as that work having two skill sets that have to be practiced and that have to be held in tension with one another. In other words, one of the skill sets is going to drive you to the other, and that other one is going to drive you back to the first one. We talk about it like 2 feet walking. And I've got just a simple, I'm not very technological, but I'm going to see if I can share my screen. I have just a couple of simple slides that I want to share with you to just guide the conversation. And so the first thing that I want to say is, no matter what change effort you're leading, whether it's small or large, generating and sustaining creative tension is a skill set that has to be practiced and utilized. And so watch my hands and then I'll explain the screen. You generate tension by saying, this is where we are and this is where we need to go. What you're doing is you're identifying a gap. If you can imagine a rubber band stretched over my thumbs as I hold my hands up, you're generating tension by creating the gap. You sustain tension by resisting the first 10,000 attempts that come along where people say, don't do that. And so the slide, the left hand that I'm holding up, my left hand is about getting the skill set of getting a clear sense of current reality. It's clear, shared, and compelling. And then the second hand is getting a clear, shared, and compelling sense of God's preferred future, of where we're headed. And so I would talk about both of those being a narrative. So what I believe is that everybody lives in a story. It was so fascinating to watch the 9/11 stories over the weekend and to realize that the American government and many of the American people have made up a story about what happened on 9/11 that is just promoted universally. As my wife and I were watching that, I said to her, I wonder what the single mom with 2 kids whose husband was killed in a drone strike and, in one of the Middle Eastern countries, I wonder what story she's living in. And just in asking the question, I recognize that what all of us do, like it is the nature of human nature, is that we have experience and then we make meaning of that experience. And so a part of this skill set is getting a narrative about current reality. I'm working with a congregation in the DC area. What I do for a living is that I'm and personal congregational coaching consultant. Work with congregations and denominational entities all over North America, and I'm working with this guy in the Washington D.C. area who started a church about 7 years ago that was an intentionally multi-ethnic, multicultural church attempting to minister in an environment that was multi-faith. He's a white guy, he had a white associate pastor, and the farther they moved into that journey, the more the white associate pastor began to sabotage the work that the senior pastor was attempting to do, ultimately coming and resigning and accusing the senior pastor of being a heretic. And that's not the language he used, what he said to him. I mean, that was what he conveyed to him. And over about a year's period of time, this white pastor left and 2 African-American elders also left the church. And so now you have a church plant that was 200 people. 7 years later, they're about 60 people. And when I first started coaching him, I said, so what is the story of current reality? Like, what's the story that people are telling of a church plant that was all those things that I just described, that grew to 200 people over 7 years, and then had a white senior executive pastor and 2 African-American elders who left the church? They're telling a story about that. What is that story? And so I did some work with him over a several week period of time where he clarified the story he was telling. And then he sat down with some of his key leaders who were still in the church and just listened to them as they told the story. And what he did was he collaborated on getting a clear, shared, and compelling picture of current reality. Now, the next step I would be doing with him in his work would be to get a clear, shared, and compelling picture of the future that he's trying to move to. What is it that they collectively discern that God is calling them to do and to be, and to describe that picture of a future that is described as clearly and in as much of a shared way as you can, while also holding it lightly. And we say hold it lightly because imagine if you made your strategic plan for God's preferred future in January of 2021. That plan would have been useless, worthless, because of the pace of change and the nature of all of that. And so you work on that, you get it clear, shared, and compelling. You do a discernment process, but you work on a narrative. And so then you're holding two narratives up side by side. And this skill set, you generate creative tension by holding those two stories side by side in an ongoing kind of way, where you sustain the creative tension in a holding environment. The other piece of the diagram is a default future. You know, there's a lot of us, a lot of leaders that I work with who would say, boy, if we could just hold on to what we got, then that would be okay with me. But actually, the pace of change is such. People die, people move. The dynamics that we live in are so rapidly changing that there is a default future. When we did this work in Union Baptist Association in 1989, we took the 40-year trend and were able to say, so over a 40-year period of time, we've lost about 19 percentage points in relationship to the population. And if you continue that over 40 years, then we're going to be less than half of the population. And all of that, the work of getting those pieces in place and then keeping them in place. And the reason, so it's hard work to like collaborate to get all those pieces in place, but keeping them in place is equally, if not more challenging. And that takes us to the second slide. So if the first skill is generating and sustaining creative tension, the second skill is managing self in the face of emotional tension. So if you don't hear anything else I say, I want you to hear this. Your brain is designed by God to experience change as threat. Now, the first time I heard that, I said, no, that can't be true. But the neurosciences are proving with increasing clarity that that is true. Even when it's a change you want, it creates threat. I will remember till the day that I die. We have 5 kids. We wanted all of them to go to college. We worked a lifetime to get them prepared to do that. And when they left, it hurt so bad. I laid on my bed and cried every time we left. And probably one of the hardest things I ever did was when my baby daughter went off to college, 8 hours from Houston. She called the first night that she was there, crying, asking if she could come home. The hardest thing I ever did was to say to her, no, you got to stay and figure out how to make this happen. Change creates a sense of threat. And so on the one hand, it's your job as the leader to generate creative tension, what scientists call potential energy. And when you do that, it's going to generate emotional tension. And those things get held in tension with one another. And so there's 4 things that I want you to remember about managing yourself. So in the face of the emotional tension, what generally will happen is that we will either fight with people about that, or we will people please and give up the change that we're trying to make. In family systems, the languages they would say is that the natural response to threat is one of these 4 things: conflict, distance, over under function, or projection. And so I use my hands a lot. You have thinking processes and you have feeling processes. And the more your feeling processes go up, the more your thinking processes shut down. Not because you're a bad person or a weak person or an untrained person, but because you're a human being. That's the way God designed us. God wants you, when the house is on fire, he doesn't want you to be able to have to call and say, hey, Jim, has your house ever been on fire? What'd you do about that? Could you give me some advice? You just automatically get into action and do whatever it is you know to do. And when there's a real threat, like the house is on fire, or the kid's in a pool who can't swim, or there's a car, somebody pulls a gun on you or something, that's a good thing. But chronic anxiety is where it feels threatening, but there's no real life threat. And so you start to say, we're here and God's calling us to go here. And somebody comes and says, why are you doing that? There's nothing wrong with what we're doing. I like the old hymns that we sing. God gave us this building for these purposes, and you're trying to change that. that's going to feel threatening to you. And one of the big leadership things is to be able to begin to see, is your go-to response to chronic anxiety, conflict? Is it distance? Is it over under function? Or is it projection? Let me just go back through those quickly. Conflict occurs on a continuum. On the mild end, it's just right, wrong thinking, agree, disagree thinking. On the intense end, it's fighting, throwing things, cursing, hitting people. And there's 100 places between the right, wrong thinking and the battle. Distance is, I'm talking to you, and all of a sudden it feels threatening. And I'm from the deep South, where we have nice down to an art form. And so what'll happen is I'll start smiling at you, but I've quit talking to you about whatever it was we were talking about. I've just shut down internally. I'm trying to be polite, but the conversation is over. On the mild end, it's that. On the more intense end, it's I move away from you, out of the room. I move out of the relationship. That's a response to anxiety. Another response to anxiety is what they call the over-under function reciprocity. And so I'm in a conversation with you. I begin to realize that I'm feeling threatened and that you are. And what I do is I give up self. And I take care of my feelings, but I also take care of your feelings. I become responsible for the way that you feel. A lot of pastors, a lot of ministry people come because they want to take care of other people's feelings. And then projection is what we would call a linear thinking, where there's a problem, and I look out here on the horizon and I say, who's to blame? Where's the fault? What do we fix? Or what I do is I feel anxious. I don't go talk to you about that, but I project that anxiety onto somebody else. I go talk to my friend or my spouse or my colleague, and now I kind of offload the anxiety and they on. All of those are natural responses to a sense of threat. Okay, let me back up again. I know I'm talking fast. I want to get to some conversation. What I'm saying to you is that in leading change, there's two big skill sets. One is generating sustaining tension. And if you do that well, the system is going to get anxious. And so how you manage yourself in the face of the anxiety that this process is generating is going to make a difference in whether or not the change process gets sabotaged or whether it can be successfully completed. So the first thing I want you to remember about managing self in the face of emotional tension is change is experienced by your brain as threat, not because you're weak or bad, but because that's the way God designed you. The natural response to threat is conflict, distance, over, under function, or projection. Now that says 5 things. It ought to say 4 things. The third thing that I want you to know is that in partnership with God's Spirit, you can overcome the natural response by disrupting the old self and putting on the new self. Okay, this is where I'd love to have a conversation. So in the New Testament, Paul talks about taking off the old self and putting on the new self. The old self is a set of habits that you learned when in what I call your first formation. So in your first formation as a child, as an adolescent, you were a small person in a big person's world, and you learned how to be safe. So I grew up I lived in the deep South. My dad was the superintendent of schools and was the superintendent of schools when court ordered immigration came to Lake Providence, Louisiana. The Protestant churches in our hometown, almost overnight, organized a private school for white kids only. My dad, because of his faith, stayed in the public school. I graduated in a class of 100. I was a junior when that happened. I graduated in a class of 129 people as the only white kid in an all-black school. My dad, and interestingly, in my little hometown, the national president of the NAACP, my dad and Reverend Scott led the civil rights movement in my little farming community. And when my dad died, people came from all over the country to talk about what an amazing man he was. What was also true was my trauma in his childhood. He was raised by his grandmother. His parents were alcoholics. His grandmother was shot and killed in his presence when he was 14 years old. That know what trauma was in the 1940s. But when he came to adult life, when his trauma got triggered in my home, it was a dangerous place to live. And so on the one hand, there's this amazing human being who was also abusive. And so what I learned about myself was there's something wrong with me that the man in life who's supposed to love me the most hits me. And I learned that authority figures can't be trusted. And so don't call attention to yourself. Don't get noticed. Don't ask for anything. Don't have any needs. Stand on the edge of the room and call, just respond when called on. Now, this is not a made up story for an illustration. This happened. I'm 26 years old. I'm on the staff of the Western Hills Baptist Church in Fort Worth, where I'm in seminary. I've been there about 3 months. The senior pastor says to me one day, "What's going on between you and Bob?" And I said, "Nothing that I know of." And he said, "Well, I just noticed about you that you're a really gregarious guy. People walk in the room, you move toward them, you shake their hands, you hug their necks, you remember things they've told you, you ask about their family and their work. But when Bob walks in the room, you stand still." Really, I'm completely oblivious to that. He said, "Yeah, and I've noticed that if he walks towards you very quickly, you actually back up." You are kidding. Like this, that's invisible behavior to me. The senior pastor named Preston Bright helped me over a several week period of time begin to realize that Bob looked like my dad. I'm 5'8", Dad was 6'2". Bob's 6'2", bald in the center of his head like my dad is, an introvert like my dad was. I have been around Bob enough with his 4 teenage children to see that he parents them in a very strict kind of manner. What's going on in that moment is my brain is saying, alert, alert, danger, danger. And I don't think about this. This is what makes it so powerful. I don't think about this. I just automatically, in my old self, do what I learned to do in order to be safe. I stand still, I back up, I don't say anything. All of those are learned behaviors that under normal circumstances, I've overcome as my new self in Christ, as I become a mature adult. But in the face of chronic anxiety, I resort to what I learned about in my first formation about how to be safe. And so there's a lot of work to be done around learning to see that. We can all do this. Like we can all deal with a little bit of anxiety and still stay connected to our beliefs and our values and our convictions. And we all have a tipping point. I've been working on this 25 years and I can still get triggered. But in partnership with God's Spirit, learning to, what I would say is learn that you can't take off what you can't name and see. And so I learned to name the behaviors that I engage in when chronic anxiety triggers my old self. I learned there's some work to disrupt that old self. I've got to get clear about who my new self is, and then I've got to learn to. And it is as I learn to live into my new self that when the system pushes back around the emotional tension of leading change, that I have the capacity to be a more calm leader who the system stay its course. Okay, that's a whole half of the course that I teach at Fuller Seminary, but that's a big deal. The fourth thing that I would say is that the goal is to learn to be defined and connected, and that takes practice, reflection, and humility. So if we could, just go down the list and all of you say, well, here's what it looks like, and I've heard what you said, and I'm just going to quit doing that, right? Then all we need to do is read a book about transformation and we'd all be transformed. But actually, Paul in the book of Romans talks about sin. He uses the word harmateia 44 times, Greek word for sin. 2 times that's a verb where he's talking about something you do. But 44 times it's a noun. It's about how you show up in relationships. And so when this happens and the system gets anxious, I'm trying to lead them to some place I want to go, and the system begins to get anxious, my natural tendency is to do conflict or distance or over-under function or projection. And when I do that, not only does, look at my hands, not only does it close, like I can make the creative tension go away by saying, oh, that vision wasn't so important. Or I can make that vision, the tension go away by saying, oh, what we said about current reality wasn't true. Both of those reduce the tension. But to actually lead change, you have to hold the tension in place until collectively you make real progress toward the future that you're attempting to move toward. And if we could read a book and grow our emotional maturity where we could be defined and connected, here's what I think, here's what I want, here's where I believe we're going, and also staying connected to the people who see that differently. If reading a book would get that done, we'd all be there. But my story, I think, is a universal story where we have a first formation that teaches us how to be safe when we are when relationships get tense, when we get anxious or stressed or confused, and left to our own devices, we will just do what we learned at our first formation. But with work and a connection to God's Spirit, we can learn to be defined and connected, but that takes practice, reflection, and humility. So let me back up. I'm going to take 60 more seconds, then I want to hear what you have to say. Way more to say than what I've said today. But what I've said today is there are two like meta skill sets. One of the skill sets is generating and sustaining creative tension. And one of the skill sets is managing self in the face of the emotional tension that the creative tension engenders. And what happens is you say, okay, well, I'm going to create this creative tension. And then the emotional tension kicks in and I have to grow my capacity to remain a calm leader. And as I do that, then we make progress toward the vision. And that requires, and so it's like 2 feet walking, where this is not a linear process where I grow my emotional maturity and then I lead change. I do think it begins with your emotional maturity, but they have a kind of symbiotic relationship with each other that that is always in play. Okay, I know that's a lot, and I know I talk really fast. This is where I'd like to be sitting around a table, and I want to do. So the question, what I would generally say is, what does that stir up in you? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you wondering? Where do you feel resistance or pushback? Where have I not been clear? We've got about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes or so, and I'll let you guide the conversation, and I'll just try to be responsive. Who wants to break the ice and go first?
I'll go. I had a question, Jim, about it. If you've got that tension, so you've got the majority of the congregation, for example, in agreement with the current reality, and agreement with the future state, that you feel God is God's vision for the congregation. But they're dramatically different. So there's a lot of change that's going to happen to get us there. Yes. Right. And so have you found value in using a change model when you have to make bigger changes, or even little changes, like a change model, like, I don't know if you're familiar with ADCAR or something like that, to help you with even something like, part of this picture is we're changing the way we do worship music. Yes. And so using the ADCAR model to help facilitate that change.
Well, so your original question was, do I find value in that? And the answer to that question is yes. So when I started learning change back in 1989, the amount of change we've had from 89 to 2021 and the pace of change, there may have been a time where we had to generate tension. The tension is there. And so with all the stuff with the pace of change that's going on. And so I think one of the beginning things that has to happen is you have to help your leaders understand the change process. Like the metacognition of how we think about change. We wrote a book called Leading Congregational Change, where we use the learning organization as the frame And so this generating and sustaining tension is the first piece of that frame. And if you went to your leaders today and said, okay, for us to do this work effectively, we're going to have to generate and sustain some creative tension. And by the way, this is going to create anxiety in the life of the congregation. The difference in them knowing and not knowing is a world of difference. If they know that they're going to generate some anxiety, then when that happens, it's like, oh, Ken told us that this was a part of the process. And then they come back and they talk about that. If they don't have some way of thinking about change that's shared, whatever model it is, then what happens is when the tension shows up, they think something's wrong. And all of a sudden, the fight is on and the chronic anxiety has been triggered. So I don't like, we use the learning organization as our model. I'm not promoting that, but the answer to your question is yes. I think it's essential that your leaders have some shared sense of how change happens and what's required of them in that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Are you having success? Are you like the ad model that you're using? Have you trained your folks with that?
Yeah, we've talked about it, and I've used it. I used it in my secular business career for years.
Mm-hmm.
But I also succumbed myself to some of those that conflict and distancing in this process when I felt threatened.
I have two, like I look back over a 42-year career, and I have two places where I could see we were clearly going in a direction. The system got anxious, and I just said, okay, we won't go there. And I really regret that. But, I was learning as I went along. Yeah. Somebody else. Thanks, Ken. Questions, comments, observations, red flags, undelivered speeches. This is the place for that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Amanda.
It is really hard for me to. I'm working on it, especially with the political issues and things like that, and just trying, let's push forward, but it's just really hard to not say you're an idiot, that's just been really, I am really trying to deal with that. Really, like you say, it is practice and leadership at the same time. It totally is, and picking up cues from people that I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good way to do it. But breathe, listen, calm down, and yeah,
What practices are you finding that help you with that?
Counseling. That's one thing. I'm just doing, just reaching out and like reading different blogs. Like I've kind of figured out about myself. I'm 51. Like I think I'm ADD. I think I got ADHD. And that was a big, that was a big thing for me, because the ADHD or whichever, it makes you want to run away. It makes you want to put the distance. That's part of it, and so that kind of put a perspective on it. But counseling, reading, and just, and just picking up cues. Like the other day, I was about to lose it, but a friend was there with me, and she spoke very calmly, because it was about vaccines, but she's dealing with the divisiveness in her family. Her family is split down the middle, so she knows how to talk with this, whereas my family is not. And so,
That's great.
This is tough. It is absolutely tough.
Let me take one step farther, because so much of what I got taught about leadership was about right, wrong thinking.
Right.
When we talk about defined and connected, here, let me see if I can spell that out a little bit more, and then say, I'm being defined when I say, this is what I think, this is what I believe, this is what I want, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm not going to do. I'm defining myself. I'm staying connected when I am doing the deep listening to someone who sees it differently than I do. So I'm listening empathically, I'm listening compassionately, I'm really working to understand how that person, what are the experiences that cause that person to see the world the way that they see the world. And so family systems, what they do is so the $64 word being defined and connected is differentiation of self. And what's true, so differentiation of self is being defined and connected. I can have a high capacity to define myself and a low capacity to stay connected. That's the bully. I can have a high capacity to stay connected, but a low capacity to define myself, which is the chameleon, right? But in both of those cases, we're not getting to where we want to go. And so depending on who you are and which one of these it is, your journey of personal development is the journey of growing that part of you that doesn't just come naturally. I'm an Enneagram 8. I was a bully when I learned to be a leader. I think I said this early on. If you were for me, then we were best friends. And if you weren't, you were an obstacle to be overcome through any means, guilt, shame, manipulation, domination. I was going to win. And so learning to be connected has been a lifelong journey for me. Now, here's the fun thing I want to say about that. It has been transformative, not magical, like not everywhere is this true, but it's been transformative when I have learned to say, I think I see that differently. That's different than saying you're wrong and I'm right. And which immediately then puts us in a battle for who's going to win. But when I can just say, and particularly if I can say it calmly, you said blah, blah, blah. First of all, I want to make sure I understood what you said. And now that I do understand what you said, I want to myself. I see that differently than you do. And here's how I see it. It doesn't eliminate anxiety, but the difference in I see that differently than no, I'm wrong, you're wrong and I'm right is a world of difference in terms of what is possible in the conversations that you have. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I even just heard in there, Jim, and thought about my own language sometimes about versus where I'll say, I disagree with you and that's okay.
Right.
But that's even more confrontational because that means, I disagree with you. I think you're wrong.
Right.
Instead of replacing I disagree with, oh, I think I see that. I see that a little differently.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I used to do